Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining the March 2025 Virginia Tech Career Wilderness Medicine Journal Club session. This month, we're going to be covering women's health. Um, I think it's going to be somewhat of a, I don't want to say more passionate topic, but somewhat more timely with our current climate in our country right now. So hopefully we can keep it more positive, I suppose. But we're going to be having a presentation and then discussing a couple articles. And I have a quick blurb I'd like to start with. Um, from one of the members of the WMS Women in Wilderness Medicine Committee. Aisha is one of the members, and she sent me something she'd like to share. First off, I hope everybody is a member of the Wilderness Medical Society. It's a really involved group, somewhat known as the more academic wilderness medicine group within the country. There's another group, actually a handful, but this one's really engaged and probably more academic, I suppose. So one of the committees in the WMS is called the Women in Wilderness Medicine Committee. So I'm going to read off the blurb they shared. Hold on, letting somebody in the room. So it's a subgroup of the WMS with a goal of connecting, collaborating, growing, whether you're a professional, seasoned professional in wilderness medicine, or simply passionate about learning more. They share invaluable knowledge, exchange experiences, and delve deep into the world of wilderness medicine, especially with a focus on creating opportunities for women in the field. As leaders entrusted with steering this committee, sorry again, baby fashion show. As leaders entrusted with steering this community, we're committed to providing with opportunities to actively contribute to our annual goals, thereby enhancing the WMS's impact within the realm of wilderness medicine. They have a social media Instagram page. I don't think they have a Facebook page. And if you're a WMS member, you'll have access to the interactive kind of message board platform called Mobilize. They have a group there as well. And feel free to reach out on Instagram or if on Mobilize with any collaborative ideas or any like WMS magazine articles you want to write or any research papers you'd like to be involved with. Otherwise, I can help connect you with anybody you'd like to be involved with as well. With that being said, I think we can kind of mix things up a bit. So we have two articles we're going to talk about, and then we're going to have a presentation. So I think it would keep it more kind of engaging, I think, to jump back and forth. So I think if we start with an article, then we can transition to the presentation and then get back to an article. That way it's not just like two back-to-back in-depth article reviews. So Caroline, Natalie, either of you feel more eager to go first or second? I think either way is fine.
It doesn't matter to me. I'm happy to go.
Okay, so Caroline, yours is definitely more science heavy.
Yes, definitely.
So I think if we start with that, that way we can kind of get into more of like the engaged, like maybe interactive portion after. How's that?
Sounds good. Sorry, my
Okay.
cat
Is that
definitely
okay, Natalie?
full appearances during this.
Okay. So go ahead and like I said, share screen's enabled and take it away.
All right, so I'm going to be talking about the article titled Women at Altitude, Sexually-Related Hypoxic Physiological Responses to Exercise in Hypoxia. So just quickly, my name is Caroline. I'm currently a second-year emergency medicine resident in Southern California at a program here. And yeah, I've been a member of the Wilderness Medicine Society since med school. Love it. Have had the chance to do some really cool rotations, both as a resident and a student. So if anyone in this group is a student and is looking at those things, like they're really valuable and you can learn a lot. So definitely a huge plug for the society, and I'm happy to be here and be a part of this. So this article, as we dive into it, just first of all, it's a pretty physiologically complex article. It definitely brought me back to those first couple years of med school and all those things that I like to not have to think about on a day-to-day basis, but it was good. I think something else that's really important to recognize is even just finding articles to talk about that we're really looking at women in wilderness medicine are very limited, first of all. Their wilderness medicine is something that is definitely growing as a field, and the involvement of female and female identifying people in this role is definitely growing. But with that being said, there's not a lot of research that really highlights this. So this article was trying to look at some of the physiological responses to exercise in hypoxia. So both looking at altitude related hypoxia and just like, artificially induced hypoxia. So This was a comprehensive literature review, and it kind of broke things into two main categories. The first part of the paper was talking about the physiological changes. They looked at ventilatory responses, cardiovascular changes, hematological changes, muscle metabolism, and then autonomic nervous system responses to these stressors. And the second part of the paper kind of talked about sex-related hormones, the menstrual cycle, pregnancy, and menopause, and how this may impact things. So what I'm going to do as I talk about this article is I'm kind of just going to go through the 5 different physiological responses and then into the second half. Again, this article is a little physiologically complicated, so please, at any point, if you have any questions, any comments, just stop me and talk. I want to make this as interactive as possible. I didn't prepare any slides or anything, so I'm just going to be talking about the article, but please, if you want to answer questions, if you want to chat, if you have any questions, get involved. All right. So the first system that this article talks about is the respiratory response. And this system seemed to be the system that was the most impacted overall to altitude and hypoxia than the rest of the systems in response to male and female differences. So generally speaking, in hypoxic conditions, our bodies attempt to maintain functional AA gradients by increasing ventilation. This is driven by chemoreceptors and is known throughout the paper as the hypoxic ventilatory response, or the HVR. So there's been a handful of studies that look at the impacts of how sex, talking biological sex here, and how this may impact this response, but the results are all really equivocal. So some studies have shown that females have higher, some show lower, and some show similar hypoxic ventilatory responses to males. Generally speaking, it's been proven that women have a relative hypoventilation with exercise. And this has been seen at sea level when compared to males. And something else that was kind of interesting was this idea of exercise-induced hypoxia has been seen both in trained and untrained women, while this has been only really seen in highly trained men. This kind of goes on to talk about some anatomical changes as well. Generally speaking, women have smaller lung volumes and airways than men, even when matched for height. And this results in a lower ventilatory capacity and results in more turbulent airflow. This turbulent airflow I thought was kind of interesting because it goes on to talk about how, well, as you increase altitude and you decrease your barometric pressure, I think that's correct, this impact of turbulent airflow may actually become kind of equivocal. However, this is only expected to be seen at elevations above 5,000 meters. And then the last thing this article kind of talked about was this idea of, respiratory speaking, is this idea of exercise-induced diaphragmatic fatigue. And this has been seen in hypoxic conditions in women more so than men. And this one was a little interesting because there's actually something that we can do about it. So there's this idea of respiratory muscle training, which can decrease the chance that you end up with diaphragmatic fatigue and actually have some implications at altitude or under hypoxic conditions. But overall speaking, in terms of the pulmonary system, women seem to be more detrimentally impacted by altitude than males. But the common theme you're going to see kind of as we go throughout this paper is that there's a lot more research that needs to be done to really figure out how significant this is. And with all these systems, there's so many, confounding variables that can affect that. So just before we move on to the next section, thinking about the respiratory system, does anyone have any questions, comments, anything they want to add to that? All right, cool. So the next section I'm going to talk about is this the cardiac and hemodynamic responses. So generally speaking, at sea level, women have higher heart rates, lower stroke volumes, lower cardiac outputs, and higher peripheral vascular resistance when compared to men. And part of this has to do with differences in body surface area. So when corrected for body surface area, it's only really been shown that females have differences in stroke volume and peripheral resistance. So that obviously will impact how we respond to hypoxic conditions. There's also been a number of studies that show that men have higher blood pressures than women before menopause. And this is related to estrogen-related vasodilation, but after menopause, this kind of shifts. And some studies have shown that females after menopause actually are more susceptible to blood pressure than men may be. With exercise and with this type of stress on the body, women have more rapid increases in blood pressure and heart rate, and their actual increase in ejection fraction is less than that of men. And it's been theorized that females rely more on this increase in heart rate to meet the metabolic demands of exercise, while men may rely more on increased preload to meet this. And then there is a little bit of talk in this article about menopause and how this may affect things. And generally speaking, premenopausal women have greater vasodilatory capacity during hypoxic exercise, and this is likely due to the increased sensitivity of beta-adrenergic receptors. So overall, cardiovascular wise, there are some differences between women and men before menopause. However, there is not a whole lot of evidence that really outlines the details behind this. All right. Any comments on the cardiovascular system? Anything anyone wants to add? All right. So next section that they talk about is hematological responses. So really focusing on like hemoglobin hematocrit values and how these may change. So generally at elevation, hemoconcentration occurs secondary to a plasma volume contraction. And it's been found that women actually have more rapidly meet these maximal hemoglobin hematocrit concentrations than men when exposed to the same altitude. And this is just a matter of a couple of days. So there was one study that looked at this response, and women generally met their maximal hemoglobin hematocrit values within 5 days, where men took about 7 days to reach this. Additionally, well, a lot of this has to do with like EPO levels that your body is producing, and there hasn't been much evidence that shows any difference between serum EPO levels between men and women. Both men and women at altitude have an increase in EPO pretty significantly in the first couple of days, which allows us to reach that maximal hemoglobin hematocrit concentration, which then kind of returns to normal within a couple of weeks. And then the last section this kind of talked about was iron stores. And overall, iron stores are necessary to have the adequate hematological adaptations with the increased hemoglobin hematocrit values that occur at exercise. And generally speaking, women have lower iron stores than men, mostly due to menstruation. So there has been some evidence that kind of talks about whether or not doing supplemental iron for women may be beneficial, or looking at like pre-altitude training and pre-hypoxic training, looking at iron levels and seeing if supplementation would be necessary to help allow this adequate response. All right. So the next section this paper talks about is muscle metabolism. Females have higher proportions of type 1 or slow switched fibers than men do, and men have been shown to have more microvascular reactivity than females. However, how this really impacts the skeletal muscle oxidative capacity is kind of variable. But overall, it's been shown that women oxidize more fat and less carbs and amino acids than men do during endurance exercise. There's actually been some evidence that supports that at high endurance activities, once you hit a certain threshold of mileage or certain threshold of exertion, women may have more beneficial responses to this due to the increased amount of fat metabolism and fat stores that women generally have compared to men. All right, and then the last section in this physiological part with autonomic responses, looking at how the autonomic nervous system varies based on hypoxic conditions and altitude. And generally speaking, hypoxia causes increased sympathetic activation and decreased parasympathetic activation. It's been shown that women have greater vagal modulation that affects their heart rates in normal oxic conditions, but it's not really clear how this really affects women in a hypoxic environment. So that was a lot of physiology, kind of going through 5 main categories about this. And the gist of it that I kind of got out of this section was there are differences that do exist, but to really piece out what these differences are, there needs to be a lot more research to evaluate this. Does anyone have any questions, comments, thoughts on that? All right, I guess I will keep talking. All right, so the next part of this article kind of looks at hormonal changes. So there's three sections that were addressed here, and it's looking at the effects of the menstrual cycle, the effects of pregnancy, and the effects of aging and menopause. And I think that this section has a lot of just implications for further research thinking about this, because when we're really talking about like what are the differences between men and women, there's a lot of things that we can come up with, but one of the main things is that we have different hormone levels and these are released over time, and this has potential to have pretty significant implications. So when we're talking about the menstrual cycle, it's been shown, generally speaking, that during the luteal phase, when high progesterone levels increase, that women have higher, or women have an increase in ventilation, an increase in basal temperature, and an increase of their resting heart rate. And it's been theorized that this actually can help women at elevation or women in hypoxic conditions. Progesterone acts as a peripheral and central chemoreceptor, or peripheral and central respiratory stimulant acting on chemoreceptors. And this can actually theoretically favor better oxygenation at high altitudes. So there was one study that was able to demonstrate this, and it was looking at it was only 9 people, but 9 highly trained women put into a hypobaric, hypoxic environment and look during the luteal phase and seeing if that had an impact on their ability to compensate. And that was shown to be beneficial, which is interesting. This paper also talked about heart rate variability, and shown that the heart rate variability didn't really seem to be affected by hormone levels when people were in hypoxic environments, even though at a baseline normal oxic condition, there are heart rate level variations. And it showed that VO2 max is not significantly impacted by these hormone levels. All right. And then moving on to the next section of this half of the paper was kind of talking about pregnancy. And this is kind of relevant because more and more people are getting exposed to hypoxic environments, whether or not that's just altitude becoming a more frequent thing. And generally speaking, there is some physiological responses to help preserve placental reserves, even with exercise in hypoxic conditions. But that requires a whole nother conversation beyond the scope of this paper. Generally speaking, pregnancy triggers hyperventilation. It also results in increased cardiac output and increased placental blood flow, and this has been shown in high altitudes. But exactly how this really matters is kind of unclear still, to go with the common theme of this paper. And the last section that it talked about was aging and menopause. So with menopause, generally over 50 is on average, you have an increased amount of osteoporosis and an increased amount of cardiovascular disease due to increased or decreased estrogen levels. There's been some studies that report that menopause occurs earlier at altitude than it does at sea level due to potentially increased gonadotrophin stimulation, which increases the number of recruited follicles and causes menopause to essentially occur earlier. However, there hasn't been a lot of evidence showing how menopause may impact your like hypoxic ventilatory response or your heart rate or anything like that. So in conclusion, kind of tying all of these topics together, I think this figure that was at the edge of the paper, I think it was like page 280, whichever one that was, did do a really good job kind of showing a conclusion of all of these differences that may or may not be evaluated or may not be present at altitude and with hypoxia. So showing that there's anatomical and exercise physiological induced changes that occur at altitude, both talking about the increase in like small twitch or type 1 muscle fibers, slow twitch fibers among women, looking at that increase in blood pressure and heart rate during exercise and seeing how this may kind of impact how we respond to altitude and hypoxic induced stress. However, generally speaking, research on this is very limited and there needs to be a lot more research done specifically targeting this to really have a good idea of how females and males have different responses to this type of environment.
All right, great job. You did a wonderful job with a very dense article, so thank you.
It
So
definitely took me a couple times to go through it and figure out
yeah.
what was going on.
Um, to summarize again what she was saying, basically, this is the only like I don't know, detailed scientific article I could find, and I couldn't even find like sure the sources were listed at the end, but like they're some of them were quite old. Um, Otherwise it's somewhat just like recommendation pieces you can find. And again, she said, I mean, I'm the one who chose the articles. There are not many, like she said, which further um, just shows how important it is to keep talking about things like this, specifically in wilderness medicine, I guess, because more and more we're seeing more diversity in our societies, in our outdoor settings. So um, if that did seem a bit laborious, that's just because there's really like not much else out there. Um, so the one other thing I wanted to mention, I'm sure she said this, but there doesn't seem to be an increased or an altered risk of acute mountain sickness
Mm.
with different genders. So it just doesn't shouldn't be a difference in risk. Um, I guess it just shows maybe slightly different training, exposure, acclimatization patterns might be needed, different questionnaires, pre-trip planning, things like that. But otherwise, specifically for altitude, can anybody think of anything different you would do if you yourself were traveling to altitude or traveling with a group at altitude? And then Natalie's article will more so explain that as well. But anything you do differently? I mean, not really, right? Basically, just shows, hey, that we find these minute differences that when you account for body surface area and like overall height, like it doesn't really change. It's just different adaptations to the different environments, whether it's stroke volume, whether it's heart rate differences, maybe slightly, as she said, diaphragmatic exercises possibly. Other than that, it's just kind of everybody should train, right? So I think we can move on. And I think I saw Aisha has joined. Are you there, Aisha? I think she's at work. Yeah. Okay. The one other thing I wanted to mention is if anybody's going to be attending this summer's WMS conference, it's in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. The summer conferences are more it's like the typical WMS conferences. They somewhat diversified them within the past 2 years. It used to be equal lengths, equal duration, like involvement. The summer is now like the meat of the WMS conferences for the year, and there's more opportunities to be involved specifically because there's just more going on. So Sunday the 19th, which is like the day of registration, the first day before actual lectures start, there's going to be in the morning, I think it starts at 10, there's going to be a student and resident hike. That's the current name for it. Since it's on a lake, it's probably going to be more like a kayaking, boating, type activity. Maybe a nice walk around the lake, but basically that's more specifically focused on students and residents. I'm organizing that. I'm just not entirely sure if I'm going to be making it. So I'll have somebody leading it, whether it's me or somebody else. And then in the afternoon, I think it starts at 2. The Women in Wilderness Medicine group are having their own activity, and I don't know the details of theirs yet. But it's more so focused on like family activities and more so obviously women as a group doing things together. So I think both of them are great for anybody who's able to make it. And again, the summer conference is more so supposed to be like easier access. So it's not going to be at some remote ski resort that costs like 400 a night. It's going to be easier for students and residents to attend. And it's like within 45 minutes of the Milwaukee airport and within about an hour of O'Hare airport. So the goal is for summer to be more accessible. So if anybody would help us out by sharing the WMS conference events and the hikes I just mentioned, our goal is to just make this a really more involved conference because it's easier to get to this time. So with that being said, I think we can transition to more of a like how things actually work presentation. So Cecilia, I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name right. Please take it away. And thanks, Carol.
Perfect. Let me just share my screen. Are you able to see it? Yeah, perfect. Can you hear me well? Perfect. So thank you, Dr. Gardner, for inviting me. And yes, you pronounced my name correctly. And thank you, Dr. Caroline, for all this talk. Very good, comprehensive review. I learned a lot. I think now we're going to switch gears from a less medically related talk to a more like experience-based. So the title of my talk would be Lessons from the Wilderness, Navigating Adventure as Women. And I think this couldn't be a more relevant subject with everything happening in this society. And I'm very happy and thrilled to be here today to share my experience and to learn so we can all learn from each other. My career in wilderness is very short, but I think I've learned a couple lessons that I'm happy to share. But I really want to make this like interactive so we can all learn from each other. So my name is Cassilia. I'm a third-year medical student at McGill University back in Montreal. Also, I'm Francophone, so I might mispronounce a couple of words in English. I apologize in advance. Apart from my medical school journey, I have been an avid traveler since a very young age, and I have always been called to nature, to remote environments, to challenges. That has always been part of me. I won't talk too much about myself because I think with the rest of the presentation, you'll get a pretty good idea of who I am. But all this to say that I think my goal with this presentation is really to showcase how women, we might have different challenges when it comes to remote environments and wilderness medicine and just wilderness adventures in all, and how we can learn lessons from that and all grow together. So this talk is going to be a series of lessons that I've learned through some experiences that I've lived. And as I said, my career in wilderness is pretty short, but I think I've learned some pretty valuable lessons that I'm happy to share. But again, every person is different. Every person has a different journey. So this is really coming from me, and I hope we can share afterwards. So the first lesson I've learned was the rise of confidence. And this lesson I learned throughout my Kilimanjaro climb that I was very fortunate to do last July. So last July, I took a plane by myself in Tanzania to climb Mount Kilimanjaro with a group of strangers that became friends at the end of the trip. At first, this experience was very daunting to me. It was very intimidating. I had been thinking about it for quite some time, as mountains have always been very inspiring to me, and I had a couple of mountaineering experiences before, but nothing as big as Africa's highest peak. And also knowing that with about 35,000 climbers every year, only 29% of them are women. So still, again, women are in a minority in all of these climbers. I gotta say, when I registered, I didn't know what I was embarking into. I just registered, took a flight. I was there and ready to take part in this journey. I had initially planned to train specifically for mountaineering, and we talked a bit about this with the previous article. I think I have a pretty good baseline as I've been doing sports my whole life, but I wanted to train specifically for mountaineering and altitude. But unfortunately, life happens, medical school is there, so I couldn't train as much as I wanted to. And then I arrived, I met the group of climbers, and then my confidence went down. Everybody seemed so fit, seemed so experienced. One of them was an ultra marathoner. The other one was a young guy from Vermont who was doing treks and twice every weekend. So I was very intimidated. And the other woman just did Compostelle, which is like the trek in Europe all the way to France. So I was very intimidating. I did not know what I was doing there. My confidence was really minus 100. But as I took my first steps, I was like, okay, this is not too bad. I'm getting somewhere. So really what I want to share with this experience is when you have like something like a mountain that seems unsurmountable, an obstacle, a challenge you want to encounter, like taking it step by step is really gonna get you a long way, and trying not to think about like the angle, but really enjoying the journey and taking a step at a time. That was really my mentality. And when we were on the climb, our guides would always say pole pole, which is the motto of the expedition, meaning slow, slow in Swahili. And that really stuck with me. And I was like, okay, let's do it one step at a time. And every day my confidence got higher, got higher. And at the end, like I had no self-doubt at all. At one point, I was certain I was going to reach a summit. Of course, some things could have happened, but I was pretty confident. And all this to say that sometimes when you have a big mountain in front of you, like taking it step by step is a good approach. And also, if you don't feel confident to take up something, I encourage you to step out of your comfort zone and try new things out there. Try to put yourself out there, and you never know what's going to happen. And these are other pictures from the expedition. So the picture on the left was just the last steps before reaching the summit on our summit push. So the summit push, we would wake up at 2 a.m. on the last night, and we had about 4 kilometers to do till the top. It was really, really challenging, especially mentally, because it was pitch dark. We couldn't see anything. We had not sleep at all. We could feel the muscle fatigue from the previous 6 days. Every step required one breath. I was really short of breath, but and I started doubting a little, but then we saw the sunrise and I kind of had a little tear, and I knew I was where I was meant to be at that moment, and everything made sense. And after we reached the top. So that was the first lesson I wanted to share. The second lesson I have to share with you is steering through stereotypes, a female's role in a male-dominated Coast Guard team. So 3 years ago, I decided to join the local Coast Guard team of my city, so at Saint-Albert, which is near Montreal. I learned about it. I didn't know it existed. I learned about it when I was at a boating salon. And there is kind of this stereotype in the field that everybody's an old, retired white male. It's almost all the group looks the same. And I kind of had this stereotype too. However, I was intrigued. I was interested into it because I had done a lot of life saving before. I was passionate about first aids. I love the water and boating. So I got interested, started talking with people. I didn't know I could join. Like, I didn't know that was accessible to me. I didn't know if I had the skills because I was kind of stuck with this stereotype that I would see. And interesting fact that in the Canadian Coast Guard, only 7% of officers are women. So that was also a very terrifying statistic. However, I decided to join. I decided to put myself out there, and everyone became like really close friends with me. They were so welcoming. And at the end of the day, I realized that even if there were some stereotypes, it's important to push through those stereotypes and also question them. Like, why is there a certain profile that's meant to fit this certain role? Is it because of skills? Is it just because of historical reasons? So I kind of questioned those stereotypes. And even though like I wasn't fit in at all, we're only 4 women in a team of over 30 men. And I'm the youngest, and the second youngest is like 15 years older than me. So it was quite a different group. But at the end of the day, like everyone is so nice and I'm having such a blast with them. So what I want to share with you is that sometimes like especially questioning those stereotypes and breaking barriers is really important if we want to move forward as a society and trying new roles. And it's not a lack of skill, really. Like everybody is super competent. Everybody has the same skills, and I may have different approaches to certain situations that my male colleagues have differently, but if we work together as a team, putting everybody where their strengths are stronger, that's how we achieve, and we can save lives. So the third lesson I want to share is running through the red zone, lesson from running the marathon on my period. So I think we spoke a bit about that with the previous article. I was trying to read up also on the topic, a big lack of research. So I got to say this is a very, I would say, stigmatized, taboo topic maybe, and that would definitely need more research. I registered to do the marathon of Philadelphia back in November, and I had registered a couple months before. And obviously, I couldn't book the date of the marathon according to my menstrual cycle. Like, obviously, that's not how life happens. And even if this seems a bit dumb, like our male runners colleagues do not have to think about that. So that was for me a surprise when I came to do the marathon. I was quite prepared, and boom, I ended up being in my period. I was a bit destabilized because I didn't like think it would happen then. And again, like when I was doing some research, I found out that running performance can actually negatively be impacted by menstrual cycle, especially because low estrogen and progesterone can lead to like the body's reduced ability to use carbs in order to create energy and rather use fat metabolism, which uses more energy. There are also other impacts such as like the inflammation and the pain perception, because when you're in your menstrual phase, their prostaglandins are higher up. So this increases pain sensitivity, muscle soreness, can have a lot of GI symptoms as well. As if running 42.2 kilometers was not enough, you also have muscle cramps, like abdominal cramps, you have mood swings, etc. So these are all things that can impact your performance. There's also a study that showed that when you're in your menstrual cycle, there's a lot of fluid retention and muscle edema. And why is that? It's because estrogen, when it peaks up just before the menstrual cycle, so it peaks and then goes down when you're having your menses. And estrogen actually activates the RAS system, so renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. So this leads to sodium and water retention, and also progesterone acts as a diuretic. So when it's lower when you're having your menstrual period, then there's less diuretic effect. So this can all contribute to having the heavy legs that we feel when running. So all this to say that I really took this opportunity, instead of like despising the woman's body and being like, oh no, like I'm having my menses, I'm not going to perform as well as I would have wanted to. I kind of wanted to switch my mind and say like, wow, it's incredible that the woman's body, the female's body is able to like run 42.2 kilometers while having all those hormone fluctuations happening at the same time. Like to change kind of this perspective and be in awe of the woman's body really like affected me a lot. And also it's a question about adapting and preparing for it. So like really focusing on hydration before, like make sure my iron was okay to not have any fatigue, anemia, and like and make sure like my electrolytes were okay. So all of these are things we can do to prepare for that and adapt. The fourth lesson I want to share is navigating strength differences, mastering the art of sailing beyond physical strength. So as many of you who are here or going to listen on YouTube, you probably have this idea that sailing requires a lot of muscle strength. Of course, like you have to haul a lot of sails, you have to crank winches against like the strong wind, you have like to steer the helm against waves, against currents, and I'm not gonna lie, it requires a lot of strength. A couple summers back, I was lucky enough to navigate and sail across the Caribbean islands with a bunch of other teenagers, and it was also really intimidating at first. And I came to realize throughout my experience that sailing is a way more complex sport than just strength. Even if it's a historically male-dominated world and women in 2025 only make 25% of sailors, which is actually not a lot, but I think it's growing. And so for sure in this circumstances, I was not the strongest crew member. Some of my male colleagues were way stronger than me. However, I learned throughout this experience that strength doesn't make you the perfect sailor. It's a combination of everything else. It's a combination of endurance, of strategy, critical thinking, creative thinking, problem solving, instinct, adaptability, and all those skills like make you as good as a sailor as just physical strength. So that's really something I learned throughout this experience. Because at the beginning, I would like blame myself that I wouldn't be a good sailor because I was not able to hold the sails as good as or as fast as my male colleagues. So, but at the end of the day, I came to realize that it requires a lot more skills than I thought. And just an example of that, at some point we were sailing from Martinique to Guadeloupe in the Caribbean, and my friends were trying to hold the sail and the sail was kind of stuck, so they were pulling and more crew members came to help, and they were not able to bring it up. And at some point, like I knew I wouldn't serve anything to help them pull, so I was just kind of watching the scene. And at some point I was just like, okay, everybody stop, like something's wrong, let's just figure out what it is. And we finally came to realize that the sail was kind of stuck in a knot. It was already starting to rip, and if we had continued just pulling and pulling, it would have ripped completely, and probably we wouldn't have made it to the other island. So sometimes, like all this to say that strength is not always the most common skill that we need to have. And a really renowned sailor named Pip Hare, she's from Great Britain, and she said that you just don't sail with your brawn, you sail with the brain. And I think that's super powerful. And all this to say that female are as valuable on the boat as our men, and this is even despite the strength differences. The fifth lesson that I learned throughout my experiences is breaking the ice, communication as the key to navigating the backcountry slopes. Again, another statistic, only 34% of alpine tourists are women. A few winters back, I had the chance to backcountry ski in Colorado. Again, I flew by myself. I joined a group of complete strangers, and they were four men locals from Colorado that were really used to skiing every weekend in the backcountry. And from my end, I'm not the most experienced skier. I know how to ski and how to tour, but not the most experimented, especially with the different environment. The mountains in Montreal and Quebec are not as big. It's a different terrain, much easier. However, I was with them in a group, and first day, I really pushed myself too hard. It was really not an enjoyable day. I was always lacking behind them, trying to follow them. I pushed myself too hard. The slopes are really out of my scope of skills. They were really steep. I was scared to say something. I was scared to communicate my fears and communicate my struggles, just because I think in retrospect, I think I had something to prove. Being the only girl in the team, I kind of had the ego somewhere wanting to prove that I still had my place with them. And however, at the end of the day, I came to injure my knee, and that's when I realized I should have spoken earlier to them. During this evening, we had a talk. I shared all my struggles, my experience. I really didn't enjoy my day, and I was like, I could not continue the whole week with you. And they were super like understandable, and we agreed to slower the pace and to take different terrains so that everybody would feel safe. And really, the moral of the story is that yes, in the backcountry, we have like satellites, beacons, and everything to communicate and stay connected in case of emergency, but we often forget the real communication happens within the team. Like if someone struggles or if someone doesn't feel safe, and communicating what our needs are, how we're feeling is really important and often underestimated. And sometimes as female in a group of men, we can feel intimidating by that. But it's important to speak up if something's wrong, if you don't feel comfortable. So that's really what I learned throughout this experience. And I think in medicine, it's really true too, especially as a medical student now doing my rotation. I see it a lot. Like you don't want to speak up when you see something happening that doesn't feel right or feels unsafe because of the hierarchy and everything. But sometimes like you have to speak up when it becomes too much. And even before it becomes too much, of course, there are ways to say things, but I think communication is the key to everything. And finally, the last lesson I want to share with you is life-saving connections, the power of community and support in ocean rescue. And I really love this title, Life-Saving Connections, because it couldn't reflect the experience and emotion more. As I mentioned a bit, life-saving has always been part of my journey, and a really big passion of mine. I was lucky enough to do my ocean rescue course when I was younger back in Australia, and then I went to help teaching it in Hawaii. And again, I think we can have this stereotype of ocean lifeguards watching, like kind of Baywatch, like the muscled man with the six pack, and then we have this lady just here for the pause and for the appearance. So it's really changing, because we can see on those pictures like it was mainly a group of women, and just this sense of community and empowerment was really strong. And even if some of us were more struggling for the races and for physical challenges, for example, everybody was cheering up on each other, and everybody was there for each other. And when people were struggling with different things, we would all be in this together, and that really is what made us go through all the course together. And at the end of the day, like we don't really remember like how we struggled to do this, or what technique specifically we learned, but we remember those friendships and those connections we made. And I also want to make this link with thanking the women in wilderness medicine, and creating this sense of community is very, very important. So I'm very happy to be part of this community and to meet other like-minded individuals. I think the sense of network is super important. And also with that, like having role models in the field, as we said, like wilderness medicine is changing, but I still think there are fewer female role models in the field. So having like a strong female physician, or someone doing something that you're passionate about or that you're looking forward to doing in the future, I think it's super important. So I very value mentorship. And that's it for the lessons. As I said, like this was coming from my own experience, but I think I've learned something through all of these. So I'm very happy to have shared that with you. I left my contact here because, again, like for me, community and networking is super important. And I would be very happy to exchange and learn and grow from all of you. So you can reach out anytime if you have questions or any thoughts, comments we can discuss here also. I'm just putting my plug, been the president of the Wilderness Medicine Interest Group at McGill University for quite some year now. So I've put the email address here, our Instagram. So if anyone is doing an event, wants to collaborate in wilderness medicine, we would be very happy to do so. And I will also definitely share the conference that's coming up with our team members. So thank you again. And I'm free to take any comments, thoughts, experiences from others.
Hi there. Thanks for sharing all of that with us. I just wanted to make a comment. I am a medical student at Virginia Tech Carilion, and we just did a study where we were asking ultramarathon runners about their periods and pelvic floor health, and it's under revisions right now, so I won't give too much away. But we did notice that there were quite a few, like an overwhelming majority of the runners who said that they actually like had never canceled a race due to their menses, and a lot of them had actually done races on their menses. And so like so much so that we decided that we're probably going to do some follow-up studies to that. But just anecdotally hearing from these runners, a lot of them were like even celebrating having their periods during their runs, because they were saying, even though there's that drop in estrogen and progesterone, that made it so like testosterone is essentially like unopposed. And so they were like really leaning into that like they felt like, oh, like this is like when your testosterone is at the highest, I'm gonna have the best performance. So I think it's just really interesting seeing like what part of the physiology that you tend to look at can really like empower you when it comes to your period and running.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you for sharing that. Please send me the study when it's out. I'm really excited to read about it.
Yeah, we'll do.
Well, I can definitely say you've sure done a lot more than I ever did as a medical student. So great job. You've gotten super involved and a ton of experience already. Does anybody have any questions on how you can be involved like she has, or barriers that you've experienced trying to get involved like she has?
I can
One
add some.
benefit I can, I'm sorry, please.
Oh,
This is
yeah,
definitely
no
not my
worries.
realm to be talking right now, so please take it.
Yeah.
Go.
Well, we love all the insight. Thanks for that. That was really, really cool to hear about all his adventures. Yeah, I think I resonated with a lot of what you said. I think there's pretty strong gender stereotypes, not just in medicine in general, but especially in such a male-dominated field. And as females, we can kind of sometimes feel like we're at an uphill battle fitting in and, being respected for what we bring to a team, and also asking for what we need too, in terms of, if there are any adaptations to what's going on. Um, and I think that in the rescue world, especially, I think I see a lot of that happen where there tends to be a lot of very like masculine energy brought to it, and it can be kind of difficult to speak up as a woman, I think, and feel like your contributions are heard. So yeah, I think that was a really cool talk.
Thank you. And I 100% agree. Like and I think that's going to be the challenge of my life, like to speak up when you need to, because like you're always trying to make a point and prove yourself when you're in such male-dominated fields, and sometimes I find it hard to speak up because you don't want to be looking down or like thinking differently from the others. But at the end of the day, I really think it's a team effort, and like just putting the skills of everyone and their qualities where they have to. I can really think about my Coast Guard like experience when everybody's placed where they have to and where their skills are most valued. Like that's when communication is at its best, and like we can do the best rescues and like achieve incredible things. So I thank you for sharing that. I really agree with you.
And I would add too, I think that sometimes, I talk to other women in medicine and in wilderness medicine and in rescue and all these areas. And I think one thing that really struck me was, we learned about a lot of the issues behind equity and inclusion and diversity and getting females, on their feet in these types of careers. And I think it really didn't hit me until I was in training just how real these problems are, because I think throughout undergrad and medical school, I heard a lot about it, but I don't think I experienced it firsthand until I was outside of that kind of protected structure of an institution that really, is thinking about those things and is vocal about those things. And then getting more into the real world of running a business in wilderness medicine and also just being a medical, working in the ER and being a woman in medicine, that's really where you start to see, I think, the real challenges for women. And I think a lot of the themes that you talked about today are applicable not just in adventure and travel, but in a lot of areas of our careers.
I think it shows again how important things. Oh, Anna's. We have a. Let's see. Anna's left a comment here. Yeah, I agree, Anna. Everybody's done a great job. Thank you. I think I've been a member of the WMS now for something like 7 or 8 years. Not a super long time, but I can definitely say in that short time span, the proportion and representation of more diverse membership has definitely been seen. I think there was like a dip in overall membership just resolving prior to when I joined because it was such a male and ER centric group. And I think that's come a very, very long way in the past, 5-10 years. So it just goes to show how important involvement is in just getting more people engaged. And to further show that, I think at least half of the board of directors are female of the WMS. The past 2 WMS presidents are women, and the next 2, if not 3 upcoming are also women. So the definitely is showing like it, not from personal experience, but things do seem to be getting better. So please keep being involved and doing what you're doing. I've had somewhat of a unique experience. And again, I'm not trying to take this over, just kind of further advocating here. My wife's a family physician. My residency and fellowship program directors have been women. I think 5 out of 7 of our system-wide hospitals are female-led medical directors. So things are definitely looking better. Maybe it's different, parts of the world, regional, but things are definitely looking better. So I hope despite the past 10 weeks we've all been experiencing, hopefully you're keeping a positive, continued engaging, because that's the only way to, improve. So hopefully you'll all keep doing what you're doing. That being said, again, it is not my time to shine. So please, any involvement you all have to share, setbacks you face, all that, please share and hopefully, keep. Oh, Aisa's joined in. Yep. So that being said, Natalie, please take it away. And again, Cecilia, great talk. You've been superstar as a medical student. That's amazing.
Awesome. So I'll share, I think I can go ahead and share my screen. Is that right? Let's see. All right, can you guys see this? Sweet. Okay, awesome. So back to a little bit more of the scientific medical aspect, although I truly wish we could talk all day about, honestly, just the experiences that we've had in this field and how to kind of uplift each other. And maybe we can circle back to that at the end. Um, so I'll go over this publication from the Wilderness and Environmental Medicine Journal regarding first trimester pregnancies and considerations for remote travel. There are some really interesting aspects to this that I didn't even know before I read it in preparation for today. So some really interesting concepts, and then we'll get to some kind of, I try to think of some like ethical and difficult questions that we can go over at the end, because these are not always black and white areas, and these are sometimes very difficult to navigate, both from a patient perspective and from a provider perspective. So just a little bit about me before we dive in. So I am currently a PGY3 resident in Southern California, and I founded a company called Survival Med. We provide wilderness medicine education to so far more than 30,000 people across the globe, everywhere from lay people to search and rescue and physicians. And I really, really love wilderness medicine. This is kind of going to be the forefront of my career. And I'll be heading to Dartmouth to do the fellowship there next year. And in about 2 months, I'll be done with residency. So could not be more excited. Um, so I'll kind of just break down each section of this article, and then we'll cover the highlights. We won't go into too much detail because I know if you guys were interested, you probably read it beforehand, so I don't want to kind of repeat everything. But just in general, this took a look at to start out with overall female participation. Like we've said multiple times tonight, it's really growing. It's really inspiring to see so many, strong females getting out there in so many new ways and taking leadership roles, and also just, getting out and exploring all corners of the planet. Now we account for a substantial portion of all outdoor adventurers. So 41% of Everest region trekkers are females, and 46% of overall outdoor activity participants are females. So despite the still strong male stereotypes behind a lot of this, actually that disparity is very much closing. In wilderness rescue settings in Seattle, for example, 41% of the mountain rescues involved women in those years listed. And, this does bring to light some of the issues that we'll talk about regarding pregnancy specifically. And pregnant individuals are participating in all kinds of sports everywhere. But oftentimes they receive very limited professional guidance as to, how to safely engage in these things. What are safe things and what are just kind of internet folklore regarding pregnancy and travel and a lot of this stuff that falls under that umbrella. And quite a few pregnancies in the US are unintended. And so that means that, quite a few travelers out there might be unaware that they're pregnant, especially in those early days. And so this paper really focused on the potential complications in the first trimester, especially in resource limited settings. So it was a literature review, and they included, all kinds of original research and papers that were adapted to the wilderness environments. So in terms of pre-trip planning, the gist of this was basically you want to consider a pregnancy test before remote trips. And like I said, a lot of pregnancies in the US are unintended. So for those that could become pregnant, it's not a bad idea to get a test before heading into an area where you might be far from traditional medical care or run into some of these complications. There's all kinds of issues that you can think about when you're talking about travel and what's outside the norm for someone's routine. If someone is used to taking their birth control at a certain time of day and then they go on a trip and their schedule is thrown off, they're in a new environment, it may lead to, missed doses of that. Other illnesses and time zone changes can interrupt OCP use. And so that can lead to unintended or unknown pregnancies in some of these situations. And one thing that I found interesting, it wasn't discussed in this article, but I remember learning at some kind of wilderness conference I went to a few years ago that even every single NASA rocket ship that gets launched into space nowadays has a pregnancy test in their medical kit, which was a new adaptation, in recent years, something that NASA decided was necessary after they looked at what they included in their kits. I remember it was really funny learning about, they used to just advise the astronauts to abstain from sex for a certain number of months before getting on a rocket ship and leaving Earth. And obviously that's not really, you can't really control for that, and it's not really realistic. So they decided to include a pregnancy test on board. I think it's really funny just how many years it can take even these major organizations to like get with the 21st century on some of this stuff. But including a pregnancy test in your medical kit is not a bad idea. Especially if you're traveling with any kind of female of childbearing age. And one of the major issues you can run into is confirming an intrauterine pregnancy if someone does have a positive pregnancy test. So, usually we do that by transvaginal ultrasound, but obviously in a lot of these settings, you're not even going to have ultrasound. So we'll talk later on about how that can present, issues and complications in your decision making. And then having some kind of plan for advanced care if you need it, and considering the high risk factors too. So advanced maternal age, genetic issues, and how that kind of intertwines in the decision to participate, especially in high risk travel. So when it comes to non-genitourinary infections, a couple of the top ones that come to mind are going to be obviously Zika and malaria. And some of these things are extremely high risk in that first trimester specifically. DEET and permethrin are the go-to methods of preventing these mosquito-borne illnesses. And in general, we still advise avoiding travel to high-risk areas for Zika in that first trimester specifically. And then, some of the same typical medications apply, and some of them are different for pregnant patients. So for a traveler's diarrhea, typically we would think about azithromycin, and loperamide is safe, but you really want to watch for dehydration, and that goes for any kind of illness, not just diarrhea. Vaccinations during pregnancy is an area that there's a lot of misinformation, and so knowing how to advise patients, whether you're planning a trip or you're their main provider beforehand or during it, is going to be really important. And generally, we recommend an annual flu shot and up to date on COVID-19 shots. And in general, you want to avoid the live attenuated vaccines. So oral typhoid and yellow fever are typically avoided during pregnancy, but there are some circumstances if the person is at specifically greater risk, if they're traveling or living in an area that's specifically high risk for it. In some cases, it is actually recommended in kind of those more rare cases. And in general, you want to consult, get individualized guidance on the remaining vaccines, depending on where you're going to be traveling specifically. First trimester bleeding is an extremely common thing we see, in the emergency department and really in any setting. About 27% of pregnancies have early bleeding, and the majority of these go on to be, normal, healthy pregnancies. But it's extremely distressing for the person in the moment because they really don't know what's going to happen. There's all kinds of causes for early pregnancy bleeding, ranging from normal gestation to a threatened miscarriage and molar pregnancy and ectopic. And this is where confirming that it's an intrauterine pregnancy, hopefully before the trip happens, is really, really important. Because if you have a patient that you find out is pregnant or is known to be pregnant, but it's not confirmed to be intrauterine, if they start having this bleeding in a remote setting, most often it's going to be important to evacuate them because of that risk of it being one of these other things. We consider heavy bleeding to be anything 2 pads or greater an hour for 2 or more hours. And that's a little bit subjective. People aren't always great at quantifying how much they're bleeding. But that's generally what we kind of go for in terms of the marker. And in terms of field ultrasound, transabdominal ultrasound is generally less sensitive early on. And transvaginal ultrasound often isn't going to be available in these remote areas. So that kind of introduces that main issue that we'll kind of go into further. Red flags to watch out for are going to be abdominal pain and pelvic pain and a positive pregnancy test. So again, if you can't confirm that it's intrauterine, then generally you're going to suspect ectopic and you're going to need to evacuate them. And then evacuate if you're uncertain. This is kind of one of those low thresholds to evacuate. And it does kind of, bring into one of the ethical issues that we'll get into in the end, which is, this is kind of a gray area and where do you draw the line in terms of recommending evacuation and that kind of risk tolerance with this. So for ectopic pregnancies, obviously there's a huge risk of rupture. And generally they present with abdominal and pelvic pain, spotting, and they can also get some other referred symptoms like shoulder pain or syncope. So, there's a lot of overlap with some other musculoskeletal and other issues that you would run into in the wilderness. So, especially with syncope, don't forget about the possibility of pregnancy. Ultrasound clues would be an empty uterus with a positive confirmed pregnancy test. But there is a threshold where, in the early weeks of pregnancy, you wouldn't be able to see an intrauterine pregnancy anyway. So that kind of is that gray area. And you do want to immediately evacuate if the ectopic is suspected, especially in the setting of limited diagnostic availability. So for early pregnancy loss, this is the definition of it is a non-viable intrauterine pregnancy before 13 weeks. And it's often going to come with an empty sac or an embryo or fetus without cardiac activity. And confirming this in the field is very risky without prior ultrasound proof of a viable pregnancy. So it's very easy to be misled by a transabdominal ultrasound. And like I said before, transvaginal is often not going to be available. So for specific evacuation guidelines, any suspected or unconfirmed EPL needs to be evacuated unless there's an ultrasound showing a complete miscarriage with minimal bleeding. So if it is very clear that they have completed the miscarriage and they don't have any ongoing hemorrhage, that would be kind of the area where it may be safe for them to stay. But this is, again, kind of a gray zone, and it's going to come down to how comfortable you are with ultrasound skills, and also if you even have that available, and what your risk tolerance is with this. And then you have to really consider how this patient is going to be comfortable, both psychologically and physically. There's a huge, amount of grief that can go along with this. And even if they're medically stable, they may prefer evacuation just for emotional support and to kind of be in a more familiar place. Threatened miscarriage, the definition is vaginal bleeding with a confirmed intrauterine pregnancy and fetal heart activity. And like I mentioned, this is actually a very, very common thing. Over 90% of these continue on to be a viable pregnancy, but it causes a lot of anxiety when it's happening. And for heavy or worsening bleeding, you're going to want to evacuate it. But if it's light or resolving, you can recommend continuing activities if it's feasible. And there's no proven benefit to bed rest. I get that question a lot in the emergency department is, should I just lay in bed and hope for the best with this? But there's really no benefit to that. In general, they can continue their activities as normal and it won't affect the risk of this continuing on to be a completed miscarriage. And then progesterone also lacks strong evidence in terms of preventing this. And then when it comes to medications, before the trip, if possible, you're going to want to confirm RH status. Anyone who's Rh negative with bleeding needs to get the Rhode immune globulin, and that would require evacuation. And then TXA is for severe hemorrhage only. So it's unclear if it's safe in pregnancy, and you really only want to use it for a last resort if your evacuation is delayed. Typically, we would give about 1 gram IV one time and repeat it as needed, or 1,300 milligrams orally TID. And then nausea and vomiting are also extremely common. So this is something that I think a lot of people might kind of forget about in terms of remembering to test for potential pregnancy with a patient in one of these settings that has nausea and vomiting, just because there's so many other things that can cause nausea and vomiting. Whether it's related to new foods they're eating, or travelers' diarrhea, gastroenteritis, just general nausea with travel. A lot of that, a lot of the symptoms are going to overlap here, but you want to consider a wide differential for this. Appendicitis, ectopic, altitude illness, infection. And generally, we recommend in the setting of pregnancy taking in frequent small meals, avoiding fatty and spicy foods. And acupressure wristbands can actually help quite a bit too. It's where it applies a little bit of pressure to the inside of the wrist. And then for medications, first line is going to be vitamin B6 and doxylamine. Other things to consider would be diphenhydramine, promethazine, metoclopramide. Zofran is an option. I use that quite a bit in the ER for early pregnancy vomiting. But just be careful with the cardiac risks of it. And that one it's kind of fluctuated over the years in terms of how much risk they associate that with pregnancy, but generally considered pretty safe. And evacuate if they have persistent vomiting for more than 24 hours, if they're getting really dehydrated, or if their vomit turns into kind of that coffee ground look. And then to wrap things up, genitourinary infections are going to be common in both pregnant and non-pregnant travelers. There's a high risk of pyelonephritis and complications in pregnancy, though. So that's why we treat even asymptomatic UTIs in pregnancy. The same typical pathogens as usual, E. coli, Klebsiella, and generally it's safe for oral antibiotics. But evacuate if they're starting to get flank pain, worsening fever, or they're not improving in 48 hours. And then for Candida infections, generally no evacuation is needed unless other complications start to arise. And then just some a little bit tougher discussion questions that came up. So when it comes to patient autonomy in these circumstances, how would you balance the pregnant person's autonomy and desire for the adventure with the heightened risks of some of this first trimester travel? In general, what would you consider both advising them, and then, if they're falling on one end of the extreme, what would you tell them in general in terms of their ability to maintain that autonomy, but also understand the risks with it?
I can jump in. I'm no physician yet, but I think that pre-adventure, pre-travel, family doctor, GP visit could be indicated for all patient wanting to do a high risk adventure or challenge, for example. I think that companies or agencies should require this, and then it's up to the GP or family doctor if they have a age childbearing age women in their office, if they would consider doing a pregnancy test or endovaginal ultrasound as part of this mandatory pre-travel GP visit. I think that could be a solution, and then they could be cleared to do the travel. In terms of if they're already on an adventure and then deciding if you evacuate or not, whether you respect the patient's autonomy and choice versus paternalistic approach and evacuate and take your own decision. I'm not so sure about that. I don't know if there are any ethics like guidelines that are for that. I'm eager to hear your opinions on that.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's an area that, just like with some of the other things we've talked about tonight, there's not a lot of like hard and fast guidelines. And when it comes to especially remote and wilderness travel, there's just not a lot of studies on this stuff. And I think that they do have quite a robust, recommendation from the CDC in terms of preparing for international travel in pregnancy. But not all of it is applicable to this remote context. And a lot of that assumes that they still will have some access to traditional medical care. So I think that it really becomes challenging when you remove that element and you don't necessarily have all the traditional tools that you would in a traditional setting. But yeah, I think in general, my opinion would be that it's important for them to fully understand, the risks and benefits of everything. And at the end of the day, that's really your job as a doctor to educate them on that and allow them to make an informed decision and provide the tools that you can with that. And then there would be some, interesting ethical dilemmas too. Sometimes when you think about if you're in a limited life-saving supply setting, how do you balance that the allocation of those resources, whether it's rapid evacuation or something like TXA, for a pregnant traveler over a non-pregnant traveler? I could see some really interesting and tough situations coming of that if one of your patients is pregnant and maybe one isn't, then how do you fairly balance that kind of allocation of resources? And it's a very open-ended question, and I think probably difficult without having more specifics. But it would, if anyone has any experience in this or any stories or ideas on that, that'd be interesting to hear.
I think that'd be a long talk with whoever's actually like organizing the event, whether you're just the medical director, expedition leader, if you're just a member. I think the lawyers from that organization would probably have something to say, but yeah, that does actually end up being pretty complicated. Cecilia, when you were on your expeditions, did you have any experience with any of this with your trips or when the trips were being organized?
We I gotta say first, I was not there as the medical like person for the team. I was there like as a participant. Of course, like in any adventure, some medical issues come up, like a twisted ankle. On the boat, there were other medical issues to deal with. However, I've never been in a situation where resources were like at stake and we had to choose between patients. I could envision this in a case of like a disaster or like like a crisis where you have multiple patients. Usually the kind of medical emergencies I've dealt with were like only with one patient, so it wasn't like a question of like resource scarcity. For example, on Kilimanjaro, I know there are always some helicopters that can come to pick up the patients if ever like there is an emergency or if they cannot summit anymore. So I know that's available. But again, there's also an ethical question because you have to pay for these helicopters. For people who don't have insurance, there's also an ethical dilemma that comes here. And it's also like for tourists and people who pay for doing those adventures, you would assume that those people, most of them would have insurance and would have the money to pay in case of medical evacuation. But I'm thinking about like porters, for example. One of them like got a sprained ankle, but they're there to work. They're underpaid. They're not working in the best conditions. It's not really regulated. It's becoming a bit better now, but again, there's also all this ethical dilemma, like what would they do if they would have to be evacuated? Maybe there are some guidelines by certain agencies that I'm not aware of, but I'm kind of deviating a bit, but I'm just thinking about that. But in terms of scarcity of resources, I've never had to deal with anything like that.
And I didn't mean to segue too much, Natalie. I just wanted to see if like people have been on anybody's open to this, but pre-trip questionnaires you had to fill out or things like that. So sorry, keep going.
Yeah, no, that's a really good topic because I think the issue of pre-trip planning and questionnaires has a big, discussion around it too, just in terms of how forthright some people are on those. And I think that you can run into all kinds of issues with medical care if people are either unaware of certain things, like the potential to be pregnant, or if they may not feel comfortable sharing that. And I could see potential issues arising for medical providers, trip expedition leaders and, people in these remote areas that have to be gathering information from these patients. And it might be awkward or difficult for someone to share that they think that they're pregnant. It's awkward even in the emergency department. So I can imagine, in some of these situations that you might run into a little bit of difficulty getting some of that history sometimes too.
I think
Um,
part of
oh
the
yeah.
hope should be that like it's not considered like a like taboo subject in these questionnaires as well. Like if you're taking somebody scuba diving, probably shouldn't have a history of seizures, things like that. So like just it hopefully it gets more so that it's not like this topic that's just so hard to bring up. So then these things aren't like seen as a bias in a negative way. But like that's the only way you can kind of approach that, I think, is to just make it not seem like an illness to have these conditions, but just seem like something, hey, it's kind of important to know.
Yeah, and I think that ties really well into some of the other things we talked about tonight with representation of women in this space and getting more studies and more concrete, recommendations available for people and also just vocalizing like, I think not just from the patient perspective, but if you're a member of an expedition or a rescue group and you're pregnant, how does that affect your ability to participate? Does it at all in some circumstances or can we get people better educated on that aspect too? And then, oh, sorry, I think I had one more on there. Um, just about like the degree of risk acceptance and especially when you're in those gray zones, like when you can't confirm the intrauterine pregnancy and the risk is much higher. How do you communicate that, and to what degree of acceptance do you have to have that the person probably doesn't want to get evacuated? And people can be really resistant to that, but especially with pregnancy, it introduces kind of this area where people may be really uncomfortable, both from the provider and the patient perspective. So, um, any any thoughts on that, like how you would navigate some of those gray zones?
I think this kind of goes into the first question that you were talking about, and kind of at the end of the day, it's shared decision making is the number one thing when you're talking about these issues, and like going through with people till they all fully understand the risks and how not only the situation might put them at risk, but may put the rest of the group at risk too, is important to address.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like any medical condition where if it poses a threat to the rest of the group, and if you're continuing into a more remote area, you're in a resource limited setting to begin with, and then something catastrophic happens, they start hemorrhaging, there starts to be some other major issue, then how do you kind of balance that risk, not just for that one person, but to the rest of the group too? All kind of very difficult theoretical questions, I know, in general, but just kind of introduces that this is a big gray area, and a lot of it is not black and white from the medical perspective or from the patient perspective, and especially when you introduce the concept of kind of the non-traditional medical setting, it makes it challenging. Any other thoughts on any of these topics? All right, well, I'll hand it back over then.
And Natalie, can you scroll back to your very first slide?
Yeah.
Or I guess the one with the author
Yep.
titles. Yeah. So I'm not sure if anybody recognizes names here, but first off, Christine Coffey, she's the fellowship director in San Diego. She's on the board for the WMS. Let me see. Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with the rest in the top row, but Erin Hillis is at the time was a PA student. I think she's a PA now. She's really involved with the Yale PA Wilderness Medicine Wednesday events. And then of course you got Sarah Schlein. I think Natalie will be working with her pretty closely soon. She's the past committee chair for the Women in Wilderness Medicine Committee, and she is also a past board member and conference chair for the WMS. Linda Keys, I think everybody knows her, like Everest Base Camp ER doc, and basically pregnancy at altitude expert. And I think she's the vice president of the International Mountain Medical Association and past WMS president. So it's kind of a powerhouse authorship here. Just wanted to kind of shout them out because I have at least met, if not know, some of them pretty well. Great job, Natalie. I think this is again, it's only the first 14 weeks of pregnancy here, but again, it's a big topic to cover if you cover all of pregnancy in one article. But I think we've kind of covered pregnancy issues. We kind of covered some more like altitude things like that. I want to make it more of an open discussion and shut up myself, but one thing that is often talked about is things that I guess women can't do in pregnancy. You go to see your OB and they're like, oh, you can't do this, you can't eat that, you can't do this, you just got to lay around. There was a great talk by, I think it was Linda Sanders as a 14er, which is a 14-minute topic at the WMS conference. I think it was 3 years ago. If you're looking for like a talk about experiences when she was pregnant and what women can do while pregnant, I think that would be a great talk. It's on the past recordings. Has anybody rock climbed while pregnant? Not across the board. I mean, in this group. Or do you think it's something that your OB would ever recommend? Probably unless they're a rock climber. Probably.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I feel like the issue that a lot of women run into is um, their OB might not be this extreme adventurer. And so a lot of what we do, even without being pregnant, is questioned by by people out there. So when you add in being pregnant, I think that people, their default is to say don't do it and be cautious. And I think that there's not a lot of evidence backing up some of that stuff. And I remember I gave a presentation back in med school about, you know, what activities are safe. And it was just amazing to me the breadth of things that are generally considered safe in pregnancy and maybe just feel more taboo because of, you know, just the folklore around it, I think.
So just because that's the topic I brought up, but for rock climbing, they're basically recommending using upright harness. It just kind of transitions the center and the like where you're carrying your weight, and if you do fall, where the tension goes. There is one thing, a specific wilderness or outdoor event that activity that women probably shouldn't do while pregnant. Actually, it's absolutely contraindicated. It's scuba diving. But pretty much other than that, I mean, if you were doing it before at a certain skill level, activity level, you can probably keep doing that. Maybe don't start like, Olympic deadlifting, but but if things you were doing, you can pretty much continue. And I hope that makes people feel more open to continue doing things and stay active. It's important. It's incredibly important to stay active while pregnant specifically. But yeah, we see this across the board with wilderness medicine. Specifically, this topic is like your primary care doc probably isn't very aware of, unless they're environmental wilderness medicine minded, the exact recommendations of travel to a random country in Africa, unless you go to the CDC yellow book, which hopefully doesn't get taken down, the current cuts we've seen. But I mean, hopefully you just kind of like as a group of people, like-minded individuals, we can kind of look to each other for recommendations, because you might be like stonewalled when you go to your typical provider. But that's not a negative slant against PCPs in any way. My wife's one, but just shows there's not much out there that people know if they're not in this. So let's see, when you're traveling in the outdoors, the common questions are things like birth control, what you can do, what you should do on it. Anybody have personal experience that they are open and willing to share with like complications they've had while on any type of birth control, or ways you managed it yourself? I think that might be one of your most common questions you get when like recommending things to somebody.
I think one of the common complications that you do think about, I guess, with like long distance travel would be the potential for blood clots and, you know, pulmonary embolisms being a heightened risk if you're on estrogen. But I don't have any personal experience with pulmonary embolisms, but I think that that would be one thing to consider in your differential that might kind of go missed sometimes when you're thinking about why someone might be short of breath if they've, you know, been traveling recently.
I think I mean, and like any medications, you want to make sure you've got enough because who knows what country or area you're going to where you have access to it. Often they're prescription based and you're kind of out of luck. So you might take a discussion with your prescribing provider. Like she said, blood clots is, I suppose, probably the most important one. IUDs, as she mentioned, and as you mentioned in your talk, might be something to consider when a patient does have bleeding or is found to be pregnant and can have some issues, increased risk for ectopics with those. I guess specifically more menstrual care, that might be a more, probably the top two most questioned topic, I guess, in travel. Is anybody willing to share ways that they've managed? You can run a marathon while on your period. Anybody want to share like ways they've managed or option they found most useful or most difficult? Or recommendations you give to your participants, Natalie, or anything like that? Again, I guess it's a taboo topic, which I guess is hard to bring up, but
I can share like a personal like struggle for me is the environmental waste. Like when you're out there like in the mountains and like you already have a big bag of garbage and like your bag is like weighing double your weight. Like you don't want to put any environmental garbage from like your tampons or your pads, but then like if you're leaving for a long time, what do you do with that? And it's also like not super fun to travel with that in your bag for 2 weeks. So I don't know if anyone has any tips regarding that, but that has been a struggle for me.
I haven't used this personally, but I know a lot of people that use like menstrual cups instead in the backcountry because it's easier and you don't have waste. I've been on the train of having birth control that suppresses my period since I was in high school, which makes it so I just kind of take that out of the question and don't have to think about it and don't have to plan trips with it in mind. And I know that's another option a lot of women use.
it does, like Cecilia said, it does bring things into consideration, like with the leave no trace considerations. You've got, you know, some extra planning to take care of. Somewhat of a second or third hand experience I've had is when I did my diploma in mountain medicine training. I did my winter course up on what's it called, Squamish, up on the glacier above in British Columbia, and you're doing like glacier travel where you all like rope together in a chain of at least 3 people, if hopefully more than that. And I mean, you're all chained together, diverse groups, and you can't really unleash from each other. So you're like, all right, I gotta go to the bathroom. Everybody turn around for a minute. So you know, in general, if you're in like the woods or something, you can just kind of go off on your own for a minute, things like that. But definitely different, I'm sure, experience wise that people would have in those type settings. So hopefully that doesn't make people like against doing those activities, but the other things you have to deal with. Does menstrual bleeding cause an increased risk while like swimming in open seawater? That's another question I've heard a lot. Does it make sharks come after you?
I think that's been dispelled.
Yeah, same thing with bears. So like do the same stuff you're going to do with your, I mean, you probably don't want to put like your menstrual products in your same bear bag or same container that like your food is, but you know, you can always figure it out. But like kind of to take the same like leave no trace principles in mind, and then just kind of make sure you have enough for your trip. Um, has anybody used a shiwi? Again, as a guy, it feels weird asking this, but I'm just trying to keep the discussion going here. I've heard from people I've traveled with and people I work with that it works great. Does anybody not know what a shiwi is? It's kind of like a little funnel, sort of. Makes it easier to go and not like have to really expose yourself and squat down. So as far as like medical stuff, I think we can, yeah, and as far as Aisha said it, you can kind of stand and go. Um, so we can keep it positive, but has anybody faced like Cecilia kind of mentioned like these low proportions of female involvement in trips and leadership and expeditions and stuff? Has anybody felt like really uncomfortable in certain settings and found ways you got around that? Or anything you guys want to talk about? Sorry, I'm from the Midwest, guys is universal. I'm sorry. It's like, dude.
I've talked about it a bit already, but like often I feel like a lack of opportunities or just like my male colleagues being prioritized, and I don't see like I see that in wilderness opportunities or just adventure travels, like, oh, we need someone to do this, like, and they send someone else instead of me because they don't think I have the strength or the abilities to do. And I see that also, unfortunately, like in medicine, like right now, trying to think about the specialty I want to do, and sometimes just comments about like, oh, do you want a family? Yes, then you shouldn't do that specialty. So, trying to link like wilderness and medicine together, but this is like a big thing I feel, and even in 2025, the society we're in, like unfortunately, that's still very present, and sometimes it's like microaggressions that pass as jokes, but they have an underlying like message. So unfortunately, I've experienced a lot of that, and I hear a lot of my friends also.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think I have been, oh my gosh, the sun is so bright right there. I've been surprised kind of like both pleasantly and negatively, I think, in the first few years of my career, seeing, first of all, how much support there is, women supporting women out there and lifting each other up in groups like this, and getting more women involved in things like the Wilderness Medicine Society and into, rescue societies. And I think that that representation is so important, not just for topics like this, but, many others too. And um, I think it's really interesting navigating, such a traditionally male dominated area of medicine, because there are still kind of soft sentiments, I would say, around some of these things that I think we've come a long way as a society, not being so objectively sexist, but that doesn't mean that there aren't smaller things that you'll experience on a day-to-day basis, in any area of medicine. And um, like every single day in the ER, I get called a nurse at least a handful of times. And I think I don't really expect that, will ever change. But I think that that's kind of the softer end of the spectrum of some of the things I've experienced in medicine. But I do think that I think, overall we're heading in a really positive direction. And it's really cool to see so many more women getting involved in this. And I think one other thing I'll add too is one thing we didn't talk about is in regards to pregnancy in particular, how family planning and starting to have kids can affect people's perceptions of what you're willing to do in your career. And I've not personally had this happen yet, but I have had colleagues that have been, passed up on opportunities because it's assumed that they don't want to do it if they're going to be pregnant or if they're going to be, having kids. And so it's just assumed, oh, you're not going to want to go spend 3 months, on some, international trip because you have a new baby at home or, things along those lines that people can kind of jump to conclusions about, I think.
I can definitely say, as the father of a 1.5-year-old, I've not experienced any of that, but my wife definitely has from others. So it's definitely different from like parent to parent, and I guess specifically male female parental relationships. But like maybe the first couple months when my daughter was born, I had like my local wilderness group be like, hey, don't worry about being involved at all. You got this. And then it was like, hey, you're back to normal. I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I'm not ready. I got a little kid. And completely different. Nobody, I shouldn't say expected my wife to do anything. It was like more so than that. It was like, you can't do anything because you're a mom now. So I can definitely say I've seen, like, I guess, firsthand experience in that regard. It's most definitely different still. So hopefully things keep getting better. But um, but any questions on how you can be more involved? I know Aisha's working. I reach out to Cecilia for her. She shared her information. Natalie runs an outdoor medical training organization, and Caroline did our wilderness elective with us here. So it's like a lot of very involved people, and I hope you all take advantage of the resources that are kind of more and more being seen, because I think, like you said, community is really important. Um, Anything else anybody wants to talk about? Just kind of like an open mic. Every once in a while, Aisha chimes in. She's at work. I think otherwise we covered a lot. Thanks to all of our presenters and everybody asking questions. Anna, surprisingly, as an engineer, you'd be super useful to a lot of research projects. So please reach out to people. We might know a couple things that we remember from like high school and college physics, and after that, just bigger the catheter, higher the flow. That's about all we remember. So, um, and if you want to be involved in wilderness medicine, even as like a non-medical person, like research and like PhDs and that kind, like super open. So you can reach out to me and I can connect you. But we had a engineering group help us create, I think it was a hypothermia resuscitation simulation device. So like really cool ways to be involved. Oh, with that being said, next month we're getting kind of tagging off of last month's topic, which was frostbite. Next month we're going to be talking about warm water immersion and non-freezing injuries, which non-freezing injuries, I guess the difference, we're not frozen, but like otherwise remarkably similar. So I think it's going to be a kind of a cool touch point with trench foot involved. And strangely, we're seeing trench warfare over in Ukraine right now. So like it's not going away. So I hopefully you all join. I think it's next month is that topic. May we're going to be talking about eye injuries and ENT, and then in June we're going to be talking about pain management. So kind of diverse lineup. But thanks again for everybody being involved. I hope to see you next month. The recording will be posted within the next couple of months on the YouTube channel if you think anybody would like to see it. And again, please reach out to each other and stay involved. So thanks for your involvement.